Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to start the class with really good news. We are going to be able to finish the lecture today, so we won't have to have class on Friday. So we took a vote in the last class and everybody wanted to go ahead and have me make the quiz available today. It will still be open all the way until Saturday at 10 a.m. I assume that's okay with everybody here. We're good with that? Okay. So this lecture is always pretty short because next week we start talking about prison and that lecture is a really long. So we're going to take it easy this week and next week is going to be, so we don't have readings this week. The lecture is short. Next week we got a big old reading and the lecture is super long. So just that's what's going on. So after class, I will go ahead and open the quiz up. So it will be available starting at 10 a.m. today, and you have until Saturday at 10 a.m. to take it. And we will not have class on Friday. And let's see who's playing Jeopardy next week. Let me see. All right, we got Bryce Gambrell, which I don't see you. I see Bryce Hersey. Bryce Hersey, you're playing too. So both Bryces. Patrick, where's Patrick? There's Patrick. And Elijah, there you are. So both Bryces, oh, there's the other Bryce. So Bryce Gambrell, Bryce Hersey, Patrick Ivy, and Elijah Joseph. You four do not take the quiz today or this week. And on Monday, you guys are going to take it live and play Jeopardy. Okay. One other thing to note, starting with this third quiz from now on, the fifth question is always going to be name a policy implication from the lecture that we covered this week. So the last slide today, we have 4 empirical findings that we're going to practice turning into policy implications. So just make sure that you note one of those, and those can be one of your policy implications for this lecture. All right. Do we have any questions before we get started? All right, let's go over the last of the deterrence lecture. So we'll just do a brief overview before we get started. So just briefly, I wanted to cover this because most of our correctional policies or criminal justice in general, but also correctional policies are based on deterrence theory. And so I kind of wanted you to understand why a lot of them are ineffective. So deterrence theory is born from the classical school of criminology, which means that we assume human beings are rational, calculating, hedonistic, and that crime is the product of free will and rational deliberation, and there are not outside forces that push you towards crime or away from crime. Through Cesar Beccaria's contributions, we got the 3 tenets of deterrence theory: certainty, swiftness, and severity. Deterrence theory here, anytime you hear about deterrence theory, certain, swift, proportionately severe should play in your head. We went over the conceptualization of deterrence theory, these 4. So there's a personal experience with punishment, meaning you speed, you get a speeding ticket. Personal experience with punishment avoidance, you speed and you do not get a speeding ticket. Vicarious experience with punishment, your friend speeds and they get a ticket. Vicarious experience with punishment avoidance, your friend speeds and they avoid a ticket. We went over Paternoster and Becerra, who tested these and found that in fact they did play a role in whether you consider this behavior to be risky, but they did find one weird finding, which is that when you have a personal experience with punishment, it actually increases your likelihood of committing a crime instead of decreasing. They think that had a lot to do with Sherman's defiance theory or labeling theory. And we also talked about it potentially being the fact that they sampled high schoolers who are more likely to be defiant anyways. Then we went over 2 of the big flaws of the deterrence doctrine. 1, normative consensus differences, that we all agree that a specific crime is non-normative. People that don't agree are going to require different levels of punishment to get them to stop doing it, but also that people are not always equally deterred by the same punishment. And then we talked about the economic conceptualization of penal sanctions, which deals with severity. As we move forward, we're going to see that severity is one of the tenets of the deterrence theory that is the least effective, and this is potentially why. When we double the punishment, we assume that doubles the number of people that don't commit the crime or are deterred by it, when in reality, people kind of have arbitrary thresholds in their head and don't rely on the severity of the punishment. All right, let's start talking about what the empirical research says about deterrence. So most criminologists actually consider deterrence theory to be dead because it has such a weak effect on reducing crime or increasing the deterrent effect. Most of these studies span back they started in the 70s and the 80s. And researchers don't really do a whole lot of work with this anymore because we know pretty much that policies that are based on deterrence theory have such a weak effect. So let's talk about why that might be. The first one has to do with the tipping effect. So what this is saying is that at certain low levels of certainty and severity, so if the certainty of getting caught is really low or the severity is really low, then the punishment won't actually deter because it's not a credible threat, right? So for instance, when I was an undergrad at USC, one of my policing professors was a retired law enforcement officer from the area. And he told me that there was one section of the road, I forget what it's called. It's the road that goes from I-77 into downtown Columbia. I feel like that's like Highway 171 or something. Anyways, it's the road I took to get in and out of Columbia every time I went home. He told me that the city didn't have money to patrol that area. So because of that, the certainty of me getting caught speeding on that road was really low, which meant I sped on that road every time I got on it, right? Because it hadn't hit that tipping effect. The certainty of getting caught was so low that there was no deterrent effect because I wasn't threatened by it, because I knew that the certainty of me getting caught was so low, it was not a risky behavior, right? So the same thing would say, what if speeding tickets were only $1, right? That level of severity is so low, it doesn't reach a credible threat. It hasn't hit that tipping point where you're not gonna do that behavior. So when punishments are really hard, or when the severity is really low, or the certainty of getting caught is really low, it hasn't hit that tipping point, so it won't actually deter the population. So let's talk about stigma erosion, and then we'll get into stigma saturation. So part of the reason why deterrence theory works is because we are saying when we give you a sanction, there is a stigma associated with it, right? So that stigma is what keeps us from committing that crime, or one of those reasons that keeps us from committing that crime, right? So what may happen sometimes is that policies may be effective in preventing crime in the short term, but if too many people get that stigma or that sanction, it erodes the deterrent effect, right? So let me put it this way. If I asked you guys to admit if you had had a speeding ticket, probably most of the people in this class would raise their hand, and no one is ashamed to admit that they got a speeding ticket, because there's not really a stigma associated with it, right? It doesn't, we aren't super concerned about doing it. We're not really deterred by the behavior because there's not much of a stigma associated with a ticket, right? Now, if I asked you to admit if you'd spent the night in jail or been sentenced to a term of incarceration, that still has a stigma associated with it. People would be less likely to admit it and also thus more deterred by it. So if the proportion of the population who receives this sanction is so stigmatized, it's too large to be a deterrent, right? It loses its stigma effect. The stigma is eroded because everybody has it. It's no longer a stigma anymore. So sometimes the stigma erosion might only affect certain segments of the population. So this is referred to as stigma saturation, right? So if certain segments of the population are getting the sanction over and over and over again, all of a sudden that segment of the population is not stigmatized by this, right? So if we look at people that live in low income housing areas, and you look at the percentage of them that have served terms of incarceration, it is markedly different than the remainder of our population. So within that segment of the population, being sentenced to a term of incarceration is not really stigmatizing, because the way they see it, it's just a matter of time, and almost everybody that they know has been incarcerated. So threatening them with a term of incarceration is not really stigmatizing, because of how saturated that segment of the population is with that particular sanction. So part of the reason why deterrence studies show such a weak effect, one, it might be the tipping point, which means that at low levels of certainty and severity, the sanction isn't a threat anymore. Or two, it's become so normal that we're not stigmatized by it, which is stigma erosion. Or sometimes stigma erosion happens in just certain subsets of the population, which we refer to as stigma saturation, which explains why certain subsets of the population aren't threatened by a stigma anymore, because it's not actually a stigma, it's just part of life. So when you have all of these things going into the mix, when you try to come up, when you're doing an actual statistical analysis of the overall deterrent effect, it's all over the place, and it's often skewed by different subsets of the population. So when the numbers go like this to get an average, a lot of times it's that null effect, because it's skewed by different populations. So those are two reasons why deterrent studies have such a weak effect. The third one may be that we are just studying the wrong thing. So let me break down how you actually do one of these studies. So there's two ways you could study how effective deterrence policies are. One, there are objective studies, and two, there are perceptual. So an objective study looks like this. So if we want to see how effective policies are for severity, right? We might compare homicide rates for states that have the death penalty versus states that don't, right? So we're looking at the severity of punishment. Or if we wanted to look at the certainty of punishment, we might look at the proportion of the population that receives this punishment, right? Or if we wanted to look at the celerity, the swiftness, we would count the number of days between the arrest and the sanction. Those are all objective properties. They're numbers that we can look at, right? The problem with that is that we are assuming that the entire population that we're studying knows what that punishment is, because deterrence theory is based on the idea that we know what that punishment is. Therefore, we can determine if it's something that we consider to be risky. So let me ask you this, without Googling, what is the punishment for aggravated assault in this state? Does anybody know? Any guesses?
Prison time. I mean, that's
How much
aggravated assault.
What's the maximum you could get for aggravated assault in the state?
2 years.
Oh, way more than that, Gavin.
I was gonna say somewhere around 5.
Whoop, more than that.
10.
More than 10.
25.
Close, Darren. 20 years is the max you can get. Now, when you actually look at the statutes, you got to hit a lot of boxes. It's basically attempted murder.
I was gonna ask if there was like a different like levels of that, you know, if there's just assault versus aggravated assault versus simple assault.
Oh yeah, I pulled it up today. Even your professor didn't know. I had to look it up. So this is pretty normal. Ignorance of the law is very normal. So right here, so first they describe what great bodily injury is, moderate, and also we didn't need that. But anyways, here we go. So a person commits the offense of assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature, blah, blah, blah. They do all these things. So a person who violates this subsection must be imprisoned for not more than 20 years. Now, if we see this one right here, you can see through, if you do this stuff, you get a subsection of this, not more than 10. assault and battery in the first degree of a lesser offense. If you do these things right here, then you get not more than 2,500 or 3 years. So you got to check the boxes to determine, and this will, the prosecutor will be looking at the arrest report to see which penalty fits or which crime fits this, and then it goes from there. So that's what perceptual punishment is. Hold on 1 second. Let me pull this back up. Oops. So if we were to test how effective the laws were for aggravated assault in this state, it would be based on nonsense, right? It would be an arbitrary decision because we're assuming that everybody knows what the punishment is, right? So that's what perceptual punishment is. It's not the objective numbers. It's not how certain, like objectively, how certain are you to get caught, objectively, how severe that punishment is, and objectively, how fast you get the punishment. It's your perception of the certainty, the severity, and the celerity. That's what's important, not the objective properties, right? So when you do perceptual research, it goes back to those vignettes, which is basically you're surveying people and you're saying, if this is the scenario and this is the punishment, are you more or less likely to do this behavior, so on and so forth. So that's how you test perceptual properties. So a lot of the early research on deterrence was just these objective properties. And some researchers are like, you know what, I think you guys are actually measuring the wrong thing, because we're assuming that everybody knows what the punishment is, right? So in order for deterrence theory to work, the people have to know what the punishment is. So just in terms of ignorance or confusion of the laws, if that's happening with any of your population, then policies based on deterrence theory are not super effective. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about sanctions. We're going to talk a little bit about the perception of sanctions, and we're going to go back to those Stafford and Moore's 4 experiences. And then the sanctions deterrent effect, we're going to talk about if you are going to base a sanction on deterrence theory, the research shows this is how to make it most effective. But let's start with the perception of sanctions. So empirical evidence has shown that a person's perception of punishment, not the actual punishment or the objective properties, play a larger role in whether they commit a crime. And this is partially because people engage in belief updating. So let me clarify. So when we go back to these 4 right here, anytime one of these 4 things happens to you, you are updating your belief about whether you consider a behavior to be risky, right? So if you have a personal experience with punishment, most would assume that you're going to say, yep, that behavior is risky. So your belief is updated to increasing that risk. Well, according to Paternoster and Beccaro, it goes down. But either way, that's still belief updating, is that your belief is changing based on these 4 experiences, right? So that's what belief updating is. Every time an experience like this happens, we change our belief, or our belief is updated about how risky a behavior is. Research has actually shown that your peers' criminal activity is more important when it comes to belief updating than your own experiences. So what that means is these vicarious experiences, either with punishment or punishment avoidance, play a larger role in whether and how you belief update than your personal experiences. So who can explain to me why the vicarious experiences are more important than your personal experiences? Why might that be?
Maybe we're like less likely to see vulnerability in ourselves, whereas we would for others. So if someone else is continuously like getting caught, then we're gonna pay more attention and think about what they did versus just like one act of ours and act out of revenge for ours.
Yeah, you actually made 2 really good points. The point I was going to bring up as well is it might just be a sample size issue, right? Your personal experiences, that's 1 experience compared to like 10 friends. That's comparing 1 experience to 10 friends. So sometimes what our brain will do is if our 10 friends never get caught speeding on this road and then we get caught once, we see that as a fluke, right? Or even if we get caught twice and our friends never get caught, it's something weird, right? So it's less likely to update our beliefs. But if our friends' experiences start happening, that has more of an effect on moving our belief, or more of an effect on our belief update.
What about like if because sometimes it's like the fear of getting caught. Like if you actually get caught, if your friends all get caught and you see like how much of an impact it has, say like that fine like decimates them and they like can't pay bills. But if you yourself had gone through it and you're like, oh, that didn't hurt that bad, but just seeing like how it impacts your friends, I feel like might have a greater effect.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this also has a lot to do with your age. Because if you think about adolescents, they're much more likely, you know, if your friend, like I'm sure your parents said, if your friends jumped off a cliff, would you jump off a cliff? But your vicarious experiences seem to play a much larger role in belief updating than your own personal experiences. So that's one thing to note about sanctions. And because of this, it's really hard to create a sanction that is not only going to always deter you, but always deter the entire population. It's just a difficult thing to do because people engage in belief updating. So let's talk about it. If you are going to create sanctions that do deter, let's talk about how you do it. So these 4 bullets, we're going to go over the findings, and then we're going to do some, we're going to practice turning them into policy implications. Just know that these 4 bullets are out of probably 40 to 50 articles that have been summarized by me. I had to do this to pass my PhD competency exams. So these 4 come from like hundreds of studies. I mean, so many studies spanning back to the 70s all the way up to like the early 2000s. So the first thing to note is that if you can create a sanction that triggers informal sanctions, it will be more deterrent. So who knows what an informal sanction is? Sam?
Isn't like informal sanctions, like if you tell me to stop doing something, but a formal sanction would be like the government or a higher body, like, or an organization, like giving me some form of punishment?
Yes, being sassed by me is definitely an informal sanction. Receiving a speeding ticket or an arrest, that is a formal sanction, right? So if you can create a sanction that triggers other bad things that are not government or criminal justice sanction related, that's going to be a deterrent. So let me give you an example. When I was a grad student at Florida State, I also worked for them as an undergraduate instructor, and I ran the internship program for the criminal justice majors. So I was a student, but I was also employed by the university. And about, I want to say, let's see, I graduated in 2016. So this must have been around 2013 or so. Florida State passed a policy, and I received an internal memo for all employees. And they said, if you get arrested, you have either 24 or 48 hours to notify us of this arrest. What they're doing with that information was left completely blank, but I could take a guess, right? So basically what they were saying is that if I get arrested, I'm going to probably lose my job at Florida State and perhaps also get kicked out of the PhD program. Those are pretty big informal sanctions. So if I was contemplating criminal activity, I certainly wasn't doing it anymore, because that sanction of me getting arrested is now triggering informal sanctions like getting fired and losing my PhD status, right? So if you can create sanctions that trigger informal sanctions, they are much more deterrent, right? So community knowledge about an individual's probable involvement in criminal or delinquent behavior is a really good precondition for triggering informal sanctions. So if you've ever been to the gas station and you'd seen those newspapers with the mug shots, that right there will trigger all kinds of informal sanctions. So this comes out of the stakes and conformity research. So those of you that have taken criminology and you learned about social bonds theory, you probably heard about stakes and conformity. So the more stakes and conformity you have, the more you have to lose. So a stake in conformity would be like a good job, like a legal job, not like a drug dealer, unless you were working at a weed shop in Colorado, but that wouldn't be illegal, right? So having a good legal pro-social job, having a mortgage, having a family, having a car payment, all of those things are stakes in conformity. And the more stakes in conformity you have, the less likely you are to commit crimes. So when you have a sanction that can threaten those stakes in conformity, those would be informal sanctions. That's going to make it more deterrent. All right, so another way you can make sure that sanctions will actually deter, if they have to be seen as credible and fair. And this might seem pretty simple, but it's not as simple as it seems. So when it comes to being credible, the state or the local government has to actually be able to financially support this. So like I was giving you that example when I was in college, and I knew that the state of South Carolina couldn't afford to put patrol officers on that road. It wasn't a credible threat to me, so it wasn't a deterrent, right? So if the state is unable to actually follow through with with enforcing this law, it loses its credibility and it's no longer a deterrent. So for instance, the 3 strikes you're out laws in California, that is pretty much bankrupting the state. So you're starting to see prosecutors make deals so that they don't have to do that. So that threat is losing its credibility because they can't actually enforce the law. So if you want a sanction to be deterrent, make sure that you can actually do it. Otherwise, it's not going to be seen as credible and people aren't going to follow the law. If the sanction so offends the population in terms of fairness, it's also not going to be a deterrent. So who knows what jury nullification is? Has anyone heard of that phrase before?
I've heard of it, and does it have something to do with like the jury's been like almost spoiled or something, or they've heard information they shouldn't have gotten, and the jury's been they're not a good jury anymore because they've like watched a news show or an article or something, or am I thinking of something?
That's a good guess though. Jury nullification means that they will, so if the prosecution has made their case and the jury should convict, if they don't agree with the punishment that goes with it, they will vote to acquit the defendant. So for instance, this is partially why we have to have a bifurcated trial with the death penalty. So if you're up for a death penalty case, that means you get 2 trials. 1, to determine if you're guilty or innocent. And 2, if you're found guilty, then we have another jury trial to determine if you get life without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. And this was partially because of jury nullification. So if you're somebody that is staunchly against the death penalty and you were sitting on that jury and you know that voting guilty means they get the death penalty, you're going to vote innocent, right? So if the jury doesn't agree that the punishment is fair, they're not going to convict, which means the sanction will not be a deterrent. So it may not be the jury that does it. It might be that the prosecutor doesn't agree, so they refuse to file charges for that case, or the police may not agree, so they refuse to arrest for this, right? So if that sanction is so unfair that people aren't moving forward with it, it's not going to be a deterrent effect. So this may seem really simple, but these are important things to think about. So if you want a sanction to have a deterrent effect, it has to be credible and it has to be fair. Otherwise, it will lose that deterrent effect. So let's talk about the 3 tenets of deterrence theory. Every time you hear deterrence, in your head, you should chant certain, swift, proportionately severe. So of those 3, there are thousands of studies on how effective each one is. And the research is overwhelmingly showing that if you increase the certainty, that has the biggest effect, okay? When you increase the severity, it does not seem to have a deterrent effect for the reasons we went over a little bit today and on Monday. What about swiftness? Why does that not have an effect? Is that something our government can control? The answer is no.
I mean, swiftness as in like how fast things get done. I mean,
Yeah.
no, that's the government specializes in taking forever to get things done.
Yeah, so I'm like surprised that there are even studies about this at all. There's like maybe 20 of them, which is small compared to the certainty and the severity research. But celerity or swiftness, that's not really something that we can control. But what we do know, certainty has the biggest effect. So who can think of a traffic sanction that was recently passed in the last 5 to 10 years that increases the certainty of getting caught?
Like cameras, like
Yes.
red light cameras.
Oh yeah, that's a perfect example right there. That is an example of a sanction that increases certainty, right? So just implementing those red light cameras, if you see that, I mean, if I see that, I am slamming the brakes on and I'm not going through that red light, right? That will increase the certainty of getting caught. If you just double the punishment for running a red light, that's not going to have much an effect. But you increase the certainty that you're going to get caught, you're going to see a deterrent effect. Last one. So I used to do a whole slide on rational choice theory, but that's too much. If you're unfamiliar with rational choice theory, basically this was born out of deterrence theory, and it's saying that people do a cost benefit analysis before they commit a crime, right? So if we're thinking about rational choice theory and we want to make a crime or we want to make a sanction something that people would be less likely to do, based on rational choice theory, you up the severity, right? Rational choice relies heavily on severity, certainty and swiftness, not so much. But if you're just looking at a cost benefit analysis, if you want to increase the cost, you increase that severity. So we already know that increasing the severity does not work very well. So there's a lot of flaws with the logic of doing a cost benefit analysis before a crime. So first of all, a crime of passion, people that commit crimes of passion are not doing a cost benefit analysis before they commit that crime. I would make the argument that most criminals are not doing a cost benefit analysis, even if it's not a crime of passion. And even if they do, so let's assume that every criminal sits down with their little calculator and does a cost benefit analysis before they commit a crime. We just saw that people incorrectly assume what the cost is because they don't know the law, right? So even if they are doing a cost benefit analysis, chances are the formula that they are using is incorrect, right? Or they just have an inaccurate view of the cost or the benefit, just like that. And people are stupid. A lot of people are stupid. Even if they are not stupid, they may just be ignorant of the law. So their formula is wrong. So the last research finding that we have is that sanctions and policies that are not based on rational choice theory are more effective at reducing recidivism. So here are our 4 research findings, and we are going to turn these into policy. Okay, so I'll do the last one. I'll show you how to do this. So whenever you take a finding, here's the formula for turning it into a policy implication. So if the finding is sanctions and policies not based on rational choice are most effective at reducing recidivism, you can say, I recommend implementing policies that are not based on rational choice theory, right? Or I recommend implementing sanctions any sort of sanction and policy not based on rational choice, or I do not recommend implementing sanctions and policies based on rational choice theory. So basically what you do is you throw the word I recommend in front of that finding, okay? So let's do these three right here, and then we are done for the day. So who wants to do the first one? Come on. I need 3 volunteers and then we are done.
I recommend implementing sanctions that trigger informal sanctions.
Perfect. That's it. All right. Who can do 2 and 3? Who wants to do number 2?
I recommend implementing sanctions that are credible and fair.
Perfect. Let's do number 3. Who wants to do number 3? Okay.
I recommend the sanctions that have the largest deterrent effect for certainty.
Well, that came out a little funky. So let's try that again. You recommend implementing what?
Sanctions that would have the largest deterrent effect for certainty.
How about you recommend implementing sanctions that increase the certainty of getting
Increase the certainty of, yes.
There we have a sentence that makes sense in English. Very good, Sam. So pretty much that formula always works, but just make sure it sounds like English when you're spitting it out, okay? So questions about this lecture? All right, so let's just briefly go over what we're doing next week. Help keep you and myself straight. All right, so as soon as this class is over, I'm going to open up the quiz to be available starting at 10 a.m. today. And you have until 10 a.m. on Saturday to take it, with the exception of, oops, wrong document. Bryce Gambrell, who I believe entered after we talked about, yep, there's Bryce. So Bryce Gambrell, other Bryce, Bryce Hersey, where there's Bryce Hersey, Patrick, there you are, Patrick, and Elijah. Where did Elijah go? I lost Elijah. Is he still in here? Do we see Elijah? Oh, I see him. Okay. All right. So both Bryce's, Patrick Ivy and Eliza Joseph, do not take your quiz for quiz 3. Do not take it online. You're going to take it live on Monday morning. Okay. And keep in mind, the 5th question of every single quiz, starting with this one, is going to be name one policy implication for or from this lecture. So just keep in mind, you cannot just use the same policy implication for the rest of the quizzes. It has to be one from this lecture, okay? Question. All right, well, if nobody has anything else, I will see you all on Monday morning. Shoot me an email if you have any questions. Sam, hold on, I got a question for you real quick before you log off. If there's nothing else, I will see you guys on Monday.